It is difficult to fathom how my life could have become so tumultuous in such a relatively short period of time. 4 years ago, my wife commenced employment at Gilbert Endeavors. At the time, our children were in their teenage years, and Sarah was eager to leave the domestic environment. I was drawn to the prospect of undertaking secretarial work, which seemed to align with my skill set and interests. I am Skip Trexler, though I have always been called Austin. I was of average height and weighed less than 140 pounds when I graduated from high school. I did not engage in any competitive sports during my formative years. My primary interest was long-range shooting, which I pursued throughout high school and college. I spent the majority of my non-academic time either shooting or reloading. After 8 years, I was able to consistently hit a 2 in target shooting at 100 yards. My preferred firearm was the Marlin 336C, which uses the 219 caliber cartridge. This cartridge has been out of production for many years, but I have successfully manufactured my own from 30-30 shells with the neck facing down. Achieving success in this endeavor gave me a sense of pride and achievement that I desperately needed. While I was in college, several significant events occurred. I met my future spouse, Sarah, and my eventual business partner, Chuck Fuller. Additionally, I obtained a degree in geology, got married, and initiated a modest surveying enterprise with Chuck. Overall, my life was quite pleasant. Chuck and I never held employment with any other entity after college. Instead, each of us contributed $2, we invested $500 and began our own surveying company, focusing on smaller projects and larger real estate transactions. Despite the modest income, we were content and satisfied. Chuck married a local woman 3 months after Sarah and I did. My family owned a modest residence in Shill County, comprising a bungalow on 160 acres. We hosted all our family gatherings there. When I was younger, the Fullers had a cabin on 640 acres in Potter County. Chuck and his family engaged in hunting activities. It was utilized for no other purpose. This is all that can be disclosed at this time, as previously stated. My life began to deteriorate approximately 4 years ago. Gilbert Endeavors designed and manufactured the trainers. Its headquarters were local, but it had manufacturing plants and distribution centers throughout the country. My wife, Sarah, began working there when our twin daughters, Marcy and Mercy, entered high school. Initially, it appeared to be a beneficial arrangement. The hours where the remuneration was commensurate with the role and the location was convenient. The first year or so was optimal. GE has employed Terry Ulrich, a former National Football League quarterback, as a marketing manager and company spokesman. Unfortunately, my wife worked in the marketing department for 6 months and was inundated with stories about the esteemed Terry Ulrich. My wife and daughters were extremely enthusiastic about him. Fortunately, this admiration seemed to wane after approximately 6 months. Around the same time, Chuck and I both grew up in the area, so we were acquainted with numerous individuals who were employed in Gilbert. It proved relatively straightforward to ascertain that Sarah and Terry Ulrich had become romantically involved, given the circumstances. Our marriage was undergoing a period of decline as Sarah and I grew increasingly distant, and my relationship with my daughters also deteriorated. I did not inform her of this. She began to travel frequently for business and promotional purposes. I became a non. She would occasionally extend an invitation for me to accompany her to social events, but I was consistently ignored for the remainder of the evening. Sexual intimacy was not an option. How could one possibly endure such a lifestyle? Sarah's employment status changed the dynamic of our family life. We would typically embark on weekend and vacation trips with the entire family, at least once a year. The girls engaged in ballet lessons and football, while Sarah was active in the PTA. The girls were enrolled in Scouts every week, and we had a pizza night. The only thing they did not like was spending time in the bungalow. This was in the past. Over the past few years, Sarah's number of conference retreats and meetings has gradually increased. On several longer trips, she has taken the girls with her. I was never invited or even asked if I wanted to go. I often overheard girls telling their friends that they were not invited. The girls frequently expressed their enjoyment of the events, yet they never mentioned Terry Ulrich, despite his presence on every walk at the Gilbert's New Year's party. It was evident that Sarah was reluctant to extend invitations to me, as she was aware of my reservations. The prospect of infidelity was already a source of distress, and I was fearful of the potential consequences of my inability to control my impulses in such a situation. I was correct in my assumption that the girls were dressed in their finest attire. Marcy and Mercy were visibly excited, as this was their inaugural experience of an adult party. I did not possess a tuxedo, so I simply donned the most suitable suit I had at my disposal. Upon our arrival, we were greeted by a multitude of individuals, numbering in the hundreds. Skip Trexler expressed his satisfaction with the developments, and I was grateful for the opportunity to bring my wife and daughters to this intimate gathering. Terry Ulrich appeared to be. He finally released my hand, allowing me to observe his expression. It appeared to be a combination of disdain and amusement. The other attendees seemed to share this sentiment, as they turned their gaze away from me and departed the premises. This marked the beginning of a challenging evening. I consumed a single glass of beer and retreated to a secluded area, attempting to avoid further embarrassment for my wife and daughters. Despite my efforts to maintain composure, I was unable to prevent the evening's unfortunate turn of events. Terry Uri was a notably large individual, standing at least a foot taller than me and weighing significantly more. He was at least a foot taller than me and weighed 100 pounds more, all muscle. He was the very embodiment of a happy hand and a platform. My daughter, Dayers, crowded around the room, but my wife spent almost the entire evening next to him. She held his hand lightly for the majority of the time. Several people at lower levels made feeble attempts to engage in conversation with me. Several mid- and senior-level managers noticed me and smirked or made I was the subject of some sly remarks by individuals who seemed to be aware of my relatively junior status. I did not hear the specific comments, but the general sentiment was clear. My beer was replaced with a simple ginger ale, which I sipped slowly. I typically maintain a high level of composure, and I was able to remain calm in this situation. Many people began dancing, and I observed that the female attendees were enjoying themselves, as was my wife with Ulrich. During the final 3 hours of the evening, neither my wife nor the other women present spoke to me. A small group of men and women were conversing at a distance from the dance floor when one of the men indicated Sarah's presence. They directed their attention towards her, appeared to laugh, and then quickly averted their gaze when they perceived that I was observing them. A few minutes later, they were still visibly amused. This marked the conclusion of my social engagement for the evening. I placed my drink on the table and began to make my way towards the exit. I observed that Yuri had his hands on my wife's buttocks and she was caressing the back of his head. Before I could react, she was pulling his head down and giving him a large, sloppy kiss right in the middle of the dance floor. I moved at a rapid pace across the room, spun Yuri around, and struck him with a roundhouse right. My arm was severely injured, and I lost consciousness. I was transported to the emergency hospital via ambulance, which was a relatively short drive. I was the sole occupant of the ambulance. I recalled being admitted to the emergency room. My subsequent recollection was of waking up in a recovery zone. Half an hour later, I was visited by a doctor who provided me with the latest updates on my condition. In addition to a broken arm, I had sustained 3 broken ribs, a broken nose, 3 knocked out teeth, and 2 additionally, my jaw was wired shut and my right kidney was bruised. I concluded the incident with a forceful blow to the testicles, resulting in damage to multiple blood vessels. The attending physician recommended a 4-day discharge period, but emphasized the necessity of at least 2 weeks of rehabilitation. I opted for the latter, given the potential benefits of in-home rehabilitation. By the time my wife and daughters arrived, it was already late afternoon. My daughters finally appeared. Sarah looked annoyed, and the girls looked bored. There was a palpable tension in the air, and I was reluctant to break it. I could talk, but I was disinclined to do so. I was not in the mood for conversation. I quickly assessed her attitude and decided that I did not need this interaction. Instead of trying to answer her, I just muttered and pointed at my jaw. We sat in silence for what felt like an eternity. A considerable amount of time elapsed before she spoke again. I was embarrassed. The girls were so humiliated that we had to leave before the new year. The entire evening was ruined. I should have foreseen that such an outcome would result from taking you out in public. I guarantee that nothing like this will happen again. She was unaware of the accuracy of this prediction. I just sat and looked at her. I was unable to even manage a smile, so I did not engage in any further action. The other party to the altercation lingered for several minutes, seemingly waiting for a reaction from me. Eventually, they got up to leave. Chuck showed up a couple of hours later, and we chatted for a few minutes. I was able to converse, and then he pulled out the local newspaper. I made it to the front page, where I saw a story about how I had attacked my wife while she was dancing at the annual Gilbert Endeavors New Year's celebration. The story also mentioned that I had attacked her while she was dancing. Eve party Terry Ulrich entered the room and held me until I was removed from the premises. While the details differ from my recollection, the incident is widely believed to have occurred as described. Following this, Chuck and I conversed for several hours, discussing various potential courses of action. After he departed, I declined to partake in the evening meal and requested sleeping pills, citing the need for a prolonged period of rest. The following day, I was subjected to a series of examinations and procedures, and any resulting injuries were duly addressed. At this point, I was confined to waiting and healing. A hospital staff member provided me with a list of recommended rehabilitation centers in the area. I selected one located near Hamburg. Chuck arrived later that evening. I sold him my share of the company for $2,500. The handshake was the most important aspect of the transaction. I remained a co-owner, though not on paper. All things come to pass in time. We found humor in the fact that 1 week in rehabilitation cost $2,500. Sarah and the girls never saw me again in the hospital. They actually returned the day after I was admitted to the rehabilitation facility. I have been informed that they were displeased to have not been informed of my admission and were angry when they were denied access. It appears that I was able to designate who was permitted to visit me when I logged in. One of the orderlies informed me that they were attempting to meet with me. My ribs were extremely painful when I laughed. One consequence of my injuries was the necessity for dental work. Fortunately, the facility had a dentist who could perform procedures on site for a fee. I elected to take advantage of this opportunity. The wound on my hand proved to be less severe than initially anticipated. However, I had the option of leaving the rehabilitation center earlier than the prescribed 2 weeks. I chose to remain for the full duration. 10 days later, I was able to perform deep breathing exercises again. It was a positive experience. Sarah did not attempt to visit me again. The National CrossFit Show was held on the second weekend of February. The event was held in Atlantic City on the second weekend of February. Sarah and the other women were in attendance, as were Terry Ulrich and the GE marketing team. Chuck and several of our employees spent the weekend moving my clothes and belongings to a bungalow in Chill County. He ensured that he took my Marlin and all my supplies for reloading. 2 days later, I was comfortable in my new home. That weekend, Chuck and his wife, June, came to visit. It appears that Sarah was sought out in the office. There had been no bank deposits into the joint account since the beginning of the year, and Sarah was seeking an explanation. Chuck spent approximately half an hour attempting to elucidate the situation to her. He informed her that not only had I relinquished my ownership of a portion of the company, but I was no longer employed there as well. In her frustration, she abruptly departed, threatening to consult with her legal counsel. After a couple of weeks, I was functioning quite normally. I engaged in psychotherapy and physical exercise as directed. Chuck subsequently departed. I was provided with one of the company trucks and a credit card. Additionally, I was given a substantial amount of cash, which I was instructed to retain in the event that it was required. My mobile phone was left with Chuck. The bungalow was a comfortable, albeit temporary, residence. I proceeded to walk and subsequently began jogging at a leisurely pace. Terry Ulrich owned a spacious residence on Dewar Street, situated just outside of town. The route leading up Mount Penn was a lengthy and winding one. The lack of housing in this area was attributed to the difficulty of constructing properties on the mountainous terrain. The residence was not difficult to locate, and I was able to identify several advantageous vantage points each morning. Following this, I engaged in physical exercise and pursued a regimen to enhance my physical conditioning. After lunch, I engaged in target shooting, focusing on inanimate targets. My Bushnell laser rangefinder indicated that I needed to be accurate at 133 yards. I will be prepared when I can consistently achieve this distance. I purchased a significant quantity of eggs and a muffler. I spent my evenings planning, adjusting, and recharging. I initiated the growth of a beard. Chuck came to see me approximately once every 2 weeks. Sarah visited the office on several occasions, still attempting to locate me. After 2 months, she ceased her efforts. Chuck consistently brought a few newspaper clippings with him. It became evident that my wife and daughters continued to enjoy a luxurious lifestyle with their new benefactor. He must have been fully supportive by then, as I did not engage in any activities. Interestingly, Sarah and the girls were still residing in our previous residence, which I was not yet prepared to accept this situation and move on. I began heading back into town early in the morning to gain a favorable vantage point from which to observe Terry's house. He was a creature of habit. I had not anticipated that such a large individual would be a skilled swimmer, but he was. The pool was heated that weekend. I traveled to Potter County, where the transition from a bungalow to a cabin was a welcome change. The cabin offered a simpler lifestyle, with no electricity, running water, or cell phone signal. The nearest Walmart was a 45-minute drive away. A brief excursion in New York revealed that a winter relocation was inadvisable. Therefore, a comprehensive inventory was undertaken, ensuring the availability of essential supplies for at least 4 months. On Wednesday morning, the office was reached, and the vehicle was duly loaded with the requisite items. The company vehicle was situated at a construction site at the base of the mountain, and I proceeded to my selected vantage point. At that time of day, there were no other vehicles present. I set up a tripod, with 1 round in the chamber and 1 in the tube, and the next 2 rounds were placed in a ready position. 20 minutes later, Terry Ulrich proceeded to undertake his morning swim. The first shot was fired. Despite the muffler, the noise was still considerable. 2 seconds later, his left knee was shattered. I loaded the next 2 rounds and took out his left elbow. His right wrist was inaccessible due to his erratic movement, so I quickly gathered my weapon and left the scene. 10 minutes later, I departed. I proceeded to the construction site and returned to the office, where I found the Subaru waiting for me. I did not return to the bungalow but instead went straight to Potter County. The initial step was to clean the source so that I would have fresh water. I then had to start collecting a good supply of firewood. Fortunately, the cabin was watertight and well insulated. LED lights were the new lighting system proved to be a significant improvement over the previous carbon oil lamps. It was now possible to resume shooting activities, this time with paper targets. During the second week, I observed a woman for the first time. She was tall and lanky, dressed in jeans, a flannel shirt, and a vest. Despite the distance, I could discern her presence. She was carrying a backpack or similar item on her back. She proceeded along an old logging trail that ran along an open area that served as a shooting range, covering an area of 640 acres. It was still the case that I had no personal life. However, it was much more practical to construct a hut next to the road, where materials could be brought in. One day, when I had the opportunity, I did so. I took aim at her, a complex crossbow hanging on her shoulder. I was uncertain of her intentions, but her weapon piqued my interest. There was a small fire pit barbecue area on the stove, so I brought along an old galvanized coffee pot and some cookies. I had baked some particularly excellent cookies. It seemed to me that I was setting some kind of trap. 3 days later my trap was effective. "I am sorry, my name is CLA. I hope we can converse." She caught me off guard. I stuttered slightly, and he gestured for her to sit. "Would you like coffee?" It was the best I could offer. She nodded, smiled, and removed the crossbow from her shoulder before sitting. "My name is Skip. I arrived approximately 2 weeks ago. I have observed you in this area on several occasions. I am currently residing at a lodge approximately 1 mile from here. I endeavor to visit this location daily and frequently find myself here." I proffered her one of my renowned cookies. "Might I inquire as to the duration of your stay?" "I intend to remain here until the end of the summer, and you until at least 4 or 5 months." She appeared to appreciate my cookies, but I sensed that she would have preferred cream. She did not mention the presence of sugar in her coffee. I simply assumed that she was not aware of it. "Is this your property?" "No, this belongs to my friend who allows me to use it." "Are you hunting?" "No, I have not done so for years. Currently, I am engaged in target shooting. I do not intend to be an inconvenience, but I hope you will not mind." If I were to utilize the shooting range for a brief period of practice, I have yet to identify a suitable location where I could employ my bow. The woman's accent was not discernible as belonging to any of the following: English, Australian, or Scottish. I was disinclined to inquire further. I am confident that we can identify a suitable location for target practice. You are welcome to utilize this range at your convenience. Upon consuming the second cookie, I experienced a profound sense of well-being. I was intrigued to learn that the majority of individuals nowadays utilize compound bows. However, you possess a recurve bow, which appears to be relatively recent. I assure you that its quality is superior. She employed simple arrows for target practice but consistently carried 4 hunting arrows mounted on a bow. That evening, I traversed the road for several miles. I proceeded to drive for several miles and retrieved 3 bales of hay. This marked the commencement of my summer with CLA Charles. CLA arrived at the lodge on a daily basis and returned to her residence each evening. The lodge staff had a tracking device on her mobile phone, enabling them to ascertain her whereabouts at all times. It was during the second week of my stay that a strong summer squall struck. We sought shelter on the porch of the cabin, laughing. She then proceeded to make light of her predicament without uttering a word. She proceeded to contact the lodge via her mobile phone, informing them that she would be unable to return that evening due to inclement weather and that she had secured accommodation for the night. I was both surprised and gratified by this turn of events, as it marked the beginning of my platonic relationship with Claire Charles. From that moment on, our relationship evolved into an intimate one. Highlands Lodge was a stark contrast to the typical accommodations in Potter County. It offered a luxurious and expensive experience, catering to a largely international clientele. Claire's family hailed from Cornwall, and Highland provided a range of amenities, including hot showers, abundant food, and laundry services, which I fully utilized. While the opportunity for outdoor sexual activity is undoubtedly enjoyable, it is much more satisfying when one has access to the necessary resources. Over the course of the following couple of weeks, we spent less and less time at the shooting range. While CLA and I were otherwise occupied, Chuck and June arrived. June seemed particularly pleased to see that I had a companion, and her satisfaction increased when she realized that it was a full-fledged relationship. In the nascent stages of our relationship, we maintained a low profile for the first few hours. Subsequently, June and I engaged in a discussion following the tragic attack on Terry. I was initially perceived as a suspect, a development that proved to be a significant challenge for Terry. The press sought to ascertain the reasons behind my presumed interest in the matter. As they delved deeper, the situation grew increasingly unfavorable for Terry and my wife. Initially, the focus was on locating me. However, as the investigation progressed, the press shifted its attention to the relationship between Terry and my wife. At the time of his disappearance, I was no longer representing the Gilbert endeavors. Police visited the Shill County bungalow and found it empty. They had no credit card leads, no phone calls, and no idea where I might be. They never asked Chuck about the cabin. Chuck mentioned that Sarah had come to the office several times trying in vain to find out where I was. She seemed to, as her source of funding began to diminish, she appeared to become somewhat desperate. According to Chuck, Terry had lost interest in her and was blaming her for his difficulties. At that point, I did not have a plan for the next step. I was unable to return and did not have any other options. I was interested in exploring further, but I was also feeling somewhat adrift as the year drew to a close. I felt that I was becoming complacent and that I should have been more attentive to my personal life. I was complacent, happy, and content with my current situation, but I should have paid attention to my real life. It was a cool autumn day, and I was alone in the hut. Something was wrong, but I couldn't figure out what it was. I had just heated up the wood stove and made coffee when the door suddenly swung open. Terry Ulrich was just as big and ugly as the last time I saw him. He stood in the open doorway with a wide smile on his face and an old police SWAT pistol in his right hand. He seemed to stand unsteadily and held his left arm at an odd angle as if he was trying to maintain his balance. We just stood and looked at each other. I expected some profound words of revenge, but nothing came. Coffee bastard. I spent over $10. I am not interested in purchasing coffee. What is your purpose here? I recognize you as the individual in question. I was informed by your wife that you engage in target shooting. I hope there is a 911 operator on the premises, as your behavior may necessitate emergency assistance. His face became noticeably red and swollen as he spoke. He suddenly appeared to become enraged. His expression changed to one of shock as he dropped the firearm and fell to one knee. Terry Ulrich rolled over on the floor and howled at the top of his lungs. A crossbow bolt, approximately 12 inches in length, protruded from his left buttock. The remaining 6 were buried deep, and the CLA stood in the doorway and smiled. We ran almost all the way back to the Highlands. I did not take anything from the cabin. It took the CLA about 15 minutes to load all her belongings into the rented Land Rover. We laughed the whole time, like a couple of high school kids. We finally calmed down to a fairly normal state when we reached mile 80. Breakfast was comforting and filling. I assume he already removed the arrow and went to the hospital. I do not believe that he should call 911. I shot him with one of the 3. The arrow, which is bladed and designed for hunting, needs to be removed surgically. It cannot be pulled out. The patient will likely have to lie on his stomach on a gurney when he goes to the emergency room. This must be an awkward situation. Miss CLA, it appears that we are in a difficult situation, and it is your fault. She flicked a fork full of scrambled eggs and laughed. Following breakfast, I contacted Chuck, and CLA contacted another individual. I provided him with an overview of the situation, and he appeared to find it somewhat amusing. I informed him that we were traveling to Ocala, Florida, where my grandparents resided. He reacted with a brief expression of amusement, as he was aware that I had only mentioned this to provide a pretext while I was on the phone. CLA subsequently arrived. Furthermore, she removed my wallet from my pocket. She then returned to her seat and continued the conversation while I procured refreshments for our journey. I was unaware of our destination, yet I sensed that CLA had a plan. She did not divulge any information, and I did not inquire. I was content with my lack of knowledge and placed my trust in her. It was a lengthy day. Eventually, we reached our destination. We proceeded to a bed and breakfast establishment in the Wisconsin valleys, where we were able to recuperate from the rigors of the journey. We enjoyed a hearty breakfast and, 4 hours later, arrived at the Douth Walmart. Claire had her belongings, but I departed with nothing. I was uncertain as to her intentions and observed that she appeared to derive pleasure from keeping me in the dark. In the absence of illumination, I procured a new wardrobe, while Claire acquired a substantial quantity of snacks. From my earliest years, I had aspired to engage in canoeing on the lake. At last, I had the opportunity to do so. Everything was arranged when we arrived. The outfitter was even going to assume responsibility for CLA's rental car, which suggested that we would not. I was compelled to return, as the experience was intriguing and exciting. I was eager to discover what else she had in store for me before leaving. I made one final call to Chuck. "What did you do? The news here is about RRI's latest failure. Even some of the national services have picked up." In addition, I overheard June laughing in the background. His media image is rapidly deteriorating. He is unable to accomplish anything successfully. This is an unfortunate turn of events for someone who is generally regarded as a kind individual. I have long wished to convey this observation. Furthermore, I believe that divorcing Sarah was a prudent decision on his part. She was not prepared for this development, and it caused her significant distress. I am unsure how you managed to achieve this result, but it appears to be effective. She is unsure of how to proceed and lacks financial resources. Chuck, I urge you to consider my advice. I am unaware of the specifics of your discussion, but I am confident in my assessment. I have no knowledge of the circumstances surrounding the divorce. She was emphasizing the necessity of the divorce and expressing her frustration just this morning. It is refreshing to receive positive news. I kindly request your assistance in collecting my belongings and vehicle from the cottage. I am currently situated in Moss Bluff, Florida. I am seeking a trailer for rental. Claire stood on the dock and waved to me. The canoe was fully loaded. I expressed gratitude to my parents, for I was compelled to attend Boy Scout camp when I was younger. At least in the canoe, I did not feel like a complete idiot. We spent the next 6 days surfing the lakes. Each night, we had a new camp. Claire was aware of her destination and utilized her cell phone GPS to reach it. I was with her and derived the greatest enjoyment from the trip. The The trip concluded with sexual intercourse under the stars. The following day at noon, our adventure resumed. A man met us at a small pier on a remote road. He and CLA embraced and conversed in French for approximately 30 minutes. He then provided CLA with the keys to the truck and an envelope. We proceeded to extract our belongings from the canoe and set off. As I proceeded down the road, I observed the men disembarking from the dock. I was operating the vehicle, while CLA began perusing the envelope. I realized that I needed to become accustomed to addressing him as Clinton. I gave her a quizzical look, and she responded with a laugh and a handover of a document. It was a driver's license with a photograph of me on it, accompanied by a birth certificate. The driver's license was identified as belonging to Clinton Barfield. It was not a joke. The individual in question is indeed Clinton Barfield, and he has a new Canadian passport. She displayed the document in a manner that indicated pride. The question was posed as to whether they were in Canada. The answer was in the affirmative. 4 days later, they landed in New Quay. 2 hours later, they arrived at Claire's family home, which is located near St. Austell. I felt a sense of belonging and contentment, as though I had always lived in this place. However, I was deeply concerned about meeting Claire's family. The mansion was immense, and her father requested my presence in his office. There was an exquisite walnut gun cabinet positioned against the far wall. I observed with keen interest as he reached inside and retrieved a rifle that he had crafted himself. I observed that the firearm in question was my Marlin 336S, which had a chambered round. I came to the conclusion that I was in a place I considered to be my home. I did not see or hear from Sarah or the girls again. Chuck and June received annual Christmas cards from Mr. and Mrs. Clinton Barfield. They were unaware that the following year's card would feature a photograph of us with our 3 children. It seems likely that he will eventually discern the truth. Was there ever truly a Terry Ulrich? Subscribe to our channel so that your second chaff does not deceive you, and proceed to listen to the subsequent narrative, as this one is insignificant in comparison to the next. If you are under the age of 18, do not even consider listening to the next one.